Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we are honored to have Professor Chen and Professor Tim Summers from the Center for China Studies to deliver a lecture on the Greater Bay Area Development and China's Dual Circulation Strategy, the Perspective of National Economic Security, which forms a part of the CUHK lecture series on National Security, the Bigger Picture. First, let me introduce Professor Chen to all of you. Professor Li is currently an associate professor at the Center for China Studies. Professor Li is also a research fellow by courtesy at CUHK's Laozhou Institute of Global Economics and Finance, IGEF. Professor Li obtained his PhD and MPhil in Development Studies from the University of Cambridge and dual bachelor degrees of Law and Economics from Peking University. Professor Li's research interests focus on a wide range of issues in China's political economy, development strategy, public policy, institutional reforms, and business environment in the global context, such as China's state-owned enterprise reform, financial regulatory reform, government-business relations, and industrial and regional development policies. Please also allow me to introduce Professor Tim Summers. Professor Summers is currently an associate professor at the Center for China Studies and a member of the Policy Research and Global China programs at CUHK. Professor Summers' teaching and research focuses on the international relations and political economy of contemporary China. Without further ado, let us first welcome Professor Li to deliver a lecture on the Greater Bay Area Development and China's Dual Circulation Strategy, the Perspective of National Economic Security. Professor Li will give a lecture for the first 20 minutes, followed by Professor Summers. Professor Li, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So it's my great pleasure to be here to share with you some of my observations on how to think about China's Greater Bay Area development in the broader context of China's dual circulation strategy from the perspective of national security, and in particular, national economic security. So, well, I will start with my observations on what has happened, right, to our global system. Right? So Financial Times used this word polycrisis, right, to describe what happened in 2022. Right? So actually, I think it's a very suitable word to describe the complex environment we're dealing with. So we have challenges in geopolitics, right? In particular, the Russian-Ukraine war. And we also face challenges caused by the normalization of U.S. interest rates, right? The concerns on financial stability, economic recession, right? The challenges posed by climate change, and all of these challenges may compound on each other. So we're dealing with a very complex environment in which we need to have new thinking on how to make sense of the global order we are dealing with, and how to think about the concept of development and security. So my personal take in this is that I think we are witnessing a paradigm shift in terms of how to think about the global system, and also in terms of how the global system works. Right? In the previous 3 or 4 decades of hyper-globalization, we have gotten used to certain ways of thinking and understanding how the world functions. And now we need to have some rethinking of this. Right? My own take in this is that, well, we used to have very popular books such as The End of History, right? And the world is flat. I think now my take is that the world is not flat. Right? There's no end of history, at least yet. Right? And in the previous decades, when we think about international relations, we very much emphasize economic rationality, right, economic interdependency, right? But nowadays, we really need to combine the concerns on geopolitical rationality and security with economic rationality and development efficiency, right? And now it's very clear that we are living in an environment in which economic interdependency cannot prevent wars, and we have seen substantial weaponization of asymmetric interdependency, right? And economic globalization is not political neutral, and there's limit in terms of nuclear deterrence, and soft power matters as much as hard power. So these are just some very broad observations. Well, so in this type of environment, right, so how does China think about national security, right? So what's the Chinese way of understanding this or interpreting this, right? China has come up with this concept of the holistic view of national security. Well, so traditionally when we talk about national security, we very much focus on the homeland security, right, the territorial aspect of it, political security, military security. But China's conception of holistic view of national security very much emphasizes other key dimensions, right? So including economic security, financial security, biosecurity, right? Science and tech security, resource security, and etc. Right? So today we will emphasize the economic security broadly speaking. Well, it's not just about some short-term events and shocks that are changing the global environment that we're living in. We are actually moving into a phase of global order that by historical experience would be characterized by substantial volatility and tensions. Right? So we are in the phase of a major change or transition in the global distribution of power across countries. Well, so again, there are many different dimensions of power, just as there are many different dimensions of security. And one aspect of it is look at the economy, right? So this is the estimated shares of global GDP adjusted by purchasing power parity. And you can see very clearly, right, in the period since 1990s, right, the most dramatic changes in the global system, arguably, would be the rise of the relative rise and rise of China and the relative decline of United States and most particularly Russia, right? So in terms of the share in global GDP. So but this is by purchasing power parity. But if you look at the market exchange rate based calculation, and the Chinese GDP is still smaller than the US. But I think the trend is pretty clear, right? The big shift is pretty clear. If you look at the picture in 1970, right, so the entire mainland China only accounted for about 3% of global GDP. But now it's over 2020, it's over 17%, right? So still below United States, but it's already the second largest economy. If you look at the contribution of mainland China in global trade, back in 1970, it's less than 1%. It's actually the entire mainland China's contribution in global trade is less than Hong Kong, one city, right? But in 2020, China has already exceeded the United States to become the world's largest trading nation, right? So China has become a central component of the global, a central pillar of the global trading system and international investment, right? And it's not just about the volume, it's also about the network composition, right? So here I highlight countries in a light red color if their trade volume with China is higher than the United States, and we color countries in light blue if their trade volume with the United States is higher than China. And then you can see that most of the countries around the world, especially in the developing world, have higher trade with China than with the United States. Right? So China is a completely different power from former Soviet Union. Right? Former Soviet Union back during the Cold War era was largely insular from the global economy, but China's case is completely different. So in terms of manufacturing output, right? So China again is the largest around the globe now, and it very much benefited from the previous 3 decades globalization, right? And China become a very important component in regional and global cross-border supply chains in many sectors. So, but that's from the economic dimension, right? So if you look at the traditional measurement of the distribution of power across countries, you would look at the military capability, right? By this standard, the United States is unquestionably still the number one. in the global system in terms of the military capability if we measure it through the spending, right, the military spending, right? So in 2010, US accounts for about 45% of global military spending, while in 2020, still 40%, higher than the next five highest countries combined, right? So, and if you look at the absolute amount, right? So since the end of Cold War, right, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, US military spending has continued to increase, right? And dwarfing everybody else, right? So, and this is a type of asymmetry that's very different from the picture offered by looking at economic development, right? And one of the biggest source of tensions to our global order nowadays is, of course, the US-China tensions, right? So just looking at economic relations, we see that there's debates in the US foreign policy community about whether the US should shift away from the engage and hedge approach to a containment approach, while China also is developing new approach of foreign policy, right? So we call it major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics, right? So Tim is actually an expert on China's foreign policy, and then we can have more discussions later on. But basically, we need to look at these initiatives, right, from both sides, right? From the United States, we have seen US launching trade wars, right? We have seen US initiating a series of policy measures trying to hit China's high-tech sector and related supply chains, right? While China is developing new initiatives, right, including dual circulation strategy and Belt and Road Initiative, right? So we need to think about these policies, initiatives in the broader context of global change, right? I think then how to understand the dual circulation strategy, right, from China's point of view. And then I cite a passage from the 14th five-year plan, as you may know, right? So China has a very sophisticated strategic development planning system, right? So the planning document is a document that you must look at, right, if you want to understand the policy rationale behind China's strategies. I think in the 14th five-year plan, it's articulated that China's policies should coordinate development and security, and accelerating the development of a new pattern, right, which is dual circulation, with domestic circulation as a mainstay, and domestic and international dual circulation mutually reinforcing each other. And China will adhere to a holistic view of national security, try to prevent and mitigate various risks that may adversely affect China's modernization, right? Here, this include strengthen the economic security risk, early warning, prevention, and control mechanisms, as well as capabilities building, and then to achieve security and controllability in critical areas, right, such as key industries, infrastructure, strategic resources, major science and technology fields, right? And strengthen capabilities in food, energy, finance, and other fields. So basically, the dual circulation is a way of thinking about China's development strategy that make distinctions between two circulations, right, or two economic circulation. One is a domestic, the domestic production, domestic distribution, and domestic consumption, right? So here, China can rely on its large domestic consumption market as well as its domestic supply chains. But relying on domestic circulation does not mean that China will move towards a more separated strategy from a global economy. That's not what it means. It actually means that China would simultaneously maintain opening up, actually deepening opening up, but will try to initiate policies that interweave domestic and external or international circulations in ways that are more effective in promoting China's economic development, balancing security and development, right? This includes develop a strong domestic market, welcome multinational companies, foreign investment to serve the Chinese consumer markets, improve domestic innovation capabilities while trying to build Chinese companies' global supply chains, incorporating global resources in strengthening China's national innovation capability, right? And also include strengthening the resilience of various critical sectors' supply chains, both inside China and outside China, removing institutional barriers that impede domestic economic circulation, right? Further expand external opening up, right? So the ideal scenario is to create this mutually reinforcing relationship between domestic economic circulation and international circulations that involve international trade and investment and supply chains, right? And we have a lot of policies already being initiated. For example, in terms of domestic market development, right? Last year, there's major policies trying to further institutional reform that remove barriers that prevent the integration of domestic market, right? So there's a lot of local protectionism inside mainland China that hinders market efficiency. So there are new policies trying to remove those barriers and also to develop a high standard market infrastructure, including logistics, information dissemination, trading platforms, right? And also in terms of creating the institutional infrastructure to support a unified market, domestic market, including property rights protection, fair competition market access, and etc., right? And in the meantime, so China has continued to accelerate opening up, right? And here, China is emphasizing, quote unquote, the high standard opening up, right? So here this includes the diversification of trading networks. So it's not just about trading with the United States and Europe, right? So China will trade more with other countries in the developing world, right? China joined RCEP. This is a major initiative that will deepen the connections between China and Southeast Asia, and also promote a high-tech product export, right? And in terms of international investment, right, two-directional investment flows, right? So it's not just about welcoming foreign companies investing in China, but also about encouraging Chinese companies investing abroad. And the third dimension is to deepen financial openness. Here, Hong Kong plays a critical role, and the whole GBA play a critical role. We have already seen major progress in terms of now the launching of various financial connectivity program, right? So including Stock Connect and Bond Connect, Wealth Management Product Connect, and etc. So, well, if you look at the trading pattern of China, so now the exports and imports as a percentage of Chinese GDP have already peaked about 15 years ago and now have trended down, which is normal given the size of the Chinese economy, while the absolute volume of export and import have continued to increase, right? And also the inbound foreign direct investment as a percentage of China's gross domestic investment have also trended down. So now the Chinese domestic investment does not really rely on external investment, right? So although the absolute amount of external investment from foreign companies have continued to increase in mainland China, right? So nowadays, to think about economic security, you have to think about supply chains, right? So in the previous decades, the production of many products have been broken down into segments that are allocated across different regions and countries. And China has benefited enormously from this process and becoming one of the major manufacturing power of the world. But this also implies, right, not only for China, but also for United States and every countries. This means vulnerability, right? So interdependence always implies a certain degree of vulnerability, right? So in terms of potential upstream and downstream shocks across the supply chains. So for example, in semiconductor industries, the US policy measures have already created substantial challenges, right, to the Chinese, a variety of Chinese sectors. So, and then it is in this context that we must further, China must, has decided to further accelerate, right, its domestic innovation capability building. And Made in China 2025 very much was about this, right? So strengthening its innovation capability across a range of key sectors. And this was back in 2015. So now we are 2022. We have already seen certain sectors making major progress, especially in terms of electric cars. So now China has become very competitive in terms of electric cars, both in domestic markets and also in export market. But in other sectors, for example, in semiconductor sectors, the progress has not been, I think more progress is needed, right, to ensure the resilience of the supply chain. And then the real sector, industrial supply chain, is one side of economic security. The other side of it is financial security, right? So we're living in a system that's dominated by the US dollar, as well as the US global financial institutions, right? So we're living under US dollar hegemony. So if you look at the US dollar share across a range of global financial markets, it's disproportionately higher, right? The share of the US in global GDP. So here, GBA and Hong Kong play a very important role in terms of accelerating the future internationalization of RMB. And we have 9 cities in mainland China, plus Hong Kong and Macau, which form a very competitive pattern of complementarity, right? So I think the most important strategic role of GBA is that it lies at the interface between China's domestic circulation and international circulation, in particular Hong Kong. So both in terms of the real sector and in terms of the financial sector. So for the details about GBA, I will leave the discussion to my colleague, Professor Tim Summers. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Li. May I now invite Professor Summers to the stage to deliver the lecture, please.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Li, for giving us, I think, such a good overview excuse me, of the global and the national context for what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start my remarks today by talking a bit about national economic security and the questions of national security, and then I'll spend the rest of my time talking about the GBA. So there's the GBA. This is a map that we produced ourselves in the Center for China Studies. So comments and suggestions are, of course, welcome to us after the lecture. But let me first of all start by talking about national security as a concept. And like many of the concepts used in both analysis and policy making, the notion of national security is a contingent one. And by that I mean that the way it is understood and operationalized depends on a number of factors across time and place. Different countries or different actors within the same country can have varying conceptions of national security, and these conceptions can and do change over time. The term national security itself really first came to prominence in the United States in the 1940s. Perry Anderson describes security as, quote, the centerpiece of the American imperial ideology in which victory, not safety, was the aim. Since the end of World War II, national security, the notion of national security, has been used in Washington to shape and justify a range of domestic and external policies, from numerous wars of choice to the domestic response to events such as 9/11, now over 2 decades ago. But another feature of national security is that there is a strong discursive or narrative flavor to the politics of national security. Politicians and other policy elites tell stories about national security, And Ronald Krebs has set this out well in a 2015 book, showing in the process that policy debate and actual policy options are constrained by what is considered politically acceptable in relation to understandings of national security at a given time and place. And I think that insight is applicable to China, it's applicable to other countries that are engaging in debates and discussions about national security just at the moment. So if national security came more to prominence in the US from the 1940s, in the Chinese context, the term national security comes rather later. Older discourse that may be relatable was structured around concepts such as order or chaos, or perhaps survival in the early years of the People's Republic. John N. Nyman, in a very new article in the European Journal of International Relations, has discussed Chinese conceptions of security, showing that national security concepts in the Chinese context have evolved out of multiple domestic and international influences. So in the process, discrete Chinese approaches or a discrete Chinese approach towards security has developed. And Professor Lee had an excellent graphic to demonstrate some of the way that that can be conceptualized and visualized. But this is one that Nyman argues has been overlooked in the international security studies literature. Looking at security and national security in the Chinese context therefore offers potential insights which can be applied more broadly in academic fields and perhaps also in the policy world. The distinctive development of the concept of national security in China has also been noted outside academia over the last decade. One of the main features of this is, as again we've seen, the integration of multiple different fields into a comprehensive or holistic notion of security, right? Historically, holistic, this 总体, has replaced 综合, sort of comprehensive notion of security. Previous generation, Jiang Zemin had his new concept of security. So there are different phases in this story of the development of discrete Chinese approaches to the notion of security. And so these policy developments and the policy language that we see today build on earlier concepts and ideas. And this includes the idea of core national interests, a slightly simpler notion perhaps than the rather more complicated picture of holistic security that we've seen. This notion of core national interests encompassing sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national development. And has long been a feature of Chinese government policy. Here in Hong Kong, over the last few years, issues around protecting sovereignty and territorial integrity have been the focus of much of the discussion of national security. While these are hardly new concerns on the part of policymakers in Beijing, as a brief review of Deng Xiaoping's remarks on Hong Kong from the 1980s will make clear, their prominence has grown in response to the unrest of 2019 and the attempts or perceived attempts to challenge Chinese sovereignty over Hong Kong, which came to a head during that period. One consequence for us here in Hong Kong has been to foreground what I'll call defensive measures in thinking about national security. The most prominent of these is the National Security Law for Hong Kong, designed to prevent and tackle threats to sovereignty and territorial integrity. But I think, given what I've said a moment ago about the historical development of ideas of security in China, these defensive measures should not be the only consequences of a policy emphasis on national security. I've already noted how economic development has been central to the understanding of core national interests. And economic security is clearly integrated into the overall or holistic conception of national security. Even for academic international relations realists who privilege political and military capability as indicators of national power, long-term security and national strength are built on a foundation of economic development. I would therefore argue that the binary juxtaposition of security and development, which is highlighted in much of the English language discussion of Chinese policy making, takes insufficient account of the way that these various elements are intertwined. It's not an either-or between development and security. And this emphasis can also bring to the fore positive visions of China's future. We should note, too, that the proactive goal of national rejuvenation stated by the leadership of China is to make China rich and strong. So on the basis of these introductory remarks about national security, which I realize have taken half my time, but I want to focus the rest of my comments on one aspect of economic development, which is particularly relevant to us here in Hong Kong, and that is the development of the Greater Bay Area. And my argument is that the success of this region is essential for China's long-term prosperity and also China's long-term security, as well as for that of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. An important part of this perspective is that economic development requires openness and engagement. We've heard about this in the context of dual circulation. And this is a feature of the GBA policy framework as we have it today, as well as the historical development of this area as a region of southern China. It's also a feature of other vision-making elements of the Chinese government today, such as the Belt and Road Initiative. So I will shift a bit to the Greater Bay Area, the GBA. And this is often talked about as a new concept, right? But the term itself is relatively new, first appearing at a national level in the 2015 Visions and Actions policy document on the Belt and Road. But as I've argued in my 2018 book on China's regions, the origins of the Greater Bay Area lie in reform and opening up after 1978. This saw the integration of the PRC into the global economy, starting with parts of coastal China, most intensively in what was then described usually as the Pearl River Delta. We can identify several phases of development here. Hong Kong as front office and the PRD as factory floor, followed by the expansion of global supply chains after China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. The Chinese economy, especially in Guangdong, moving up the value chain after the 2008 global financial crisis, and the PRC becoming a global economic powerhouse with rapid development and innovation in Shenzhen and Guangzhou in particular. I think you may have seen on Professor Lee's slide the reference to the number of Fortune 500 companies in the Greater Bay Area, right? Shenzhen is certainly a hub of vibrant entrepreneurial activity. The consequence of this is the GBA as a rich and open economy, one of the most open and vibrant economic regions of China. Amidst an aging population, we hear a lot about the demographic crisis, but the GBA has a relatively young demographic and substantial concentrations of wealth, right? It attracts lots of young people to go and work after they've finished their masters in CUHK, for example. Right? However, while the overall GDP of the GBA is comparable to Bay Areas in Tokyo, San Francisco, and New York, its GDP per capita is still between 2 and 5 times lower, depending which Bay Area you compare it to. In other areas, though, the GBA may be ahead. Infrastructure connectivity has grown substantially within the GBA, between the GBA and the rest of China, and between the GBA and the rest of the world. The region contains 3 of the 10 largest global container ports, the largest airport cluster, and so on. So these features, what I call GBA as area, are the consequences of organic economic developments over several decades, supported by national and local policies, and made possible and shaped by China's integration into a global economy during a period of globalization and relatively benign relations with the US and the West. These conditions began to change in the mid-2010s, especially after Washington's turn to a more confrontational China policy. That was the context for the publication by the State Council of an outline plan for the GBA in February 2019. This I characterize as the GBA as plan rather than the GBA as area. So one is more top-down, one is more bottom-up, if you like to think of it in those terms. And this outline plan stresses the importance of the GBA to China's next stages of development as an open, economically vibrant and internationalized region, which aims to enhance the country's international competitiveness and contributes to the strengthening of its economy. Innovation is placed at the heart of this, alongside green development and a good living environment. We could call these sort of middle to high income goals. In terms of policy making and implementation, the outline plan calls for better coordination between the cities in Guangdong and between them and Hong Kong and Macau. And importantly for Hong Kong and Macau, the plan reiterates the importance of one country, two systems, stressing that there should be a role for different cities based on their comparative advantage, an important phrase since the 1980s. This means maintaining Hong Kong's status as international financial center and developing its role in other areas, such as a meeting point between different cultures. This is a vision of mutually complementary and beneficial relationship, not a plan for homogenization. The goal is to make use of Hong Kong's distinctive features and second system, not turn it into just another Chinese city in the rather trite phrase that's so often trotted out in some of the analyses of Hong Kong. Since that plan was issued in 2019, we've seen both continuity and change. Continuities include the GBA remaining an important region for piloting and developing new policies. A good example is the Wealth Management Connect scheme, on which I shall pass questions back to Professor Li if they arise after this talk. Its status at the forefront of China's development, and a role for Hong Kong based on its distinctive system. The changes perhaps are more significant, starting with geopolitics and the impact of deteriorating US-China relations, the launch of a new chapter in Hong Kong's development, and for a period at least, the impact of COVID-19. Let me offer a couple more observations before I conclude. First, I want to comment on the term integration, which is often used when discussing the GBA. Contrary to many views, I suggest this should be understood as connectivity or enhanced connectivity. This is integration as the removal of barriers to interaction, rather than integration as the creation of a new space which brings pre-existing areas together organizationally. This is particularly relevant in thinking about Hong Kong's role and positioning in the GBA. I think there are ways in which connectivity can be enhanced further, and a number of ideas have come from traveling around the GBA since the opening after COVID. I will mention one which I have a particular interest in. Before 2019 and COVID-19, the Hong Kong government had been discussing the idea of a GBA travel card of some sort for non-Chinese permanent residents of Hong Kong, so people like myself who need to use our passport and a visa to go to Shenzhen. This would be a great way to facilitate connections across the GBA and to make Hong Kong more convenient as a base for international talent to take advantage of what the GBA has to offer. I think it would also send a message about China's openness to the outside world, and I hope it's something that can come back to the top of the policy agenda soon. Let me conclude, because I see time is running out. In conclusion, looking at the GBA and perhaps doing so alongside other major initiatives such as the Belt and Road or dual circulation, I think highlights the complexity and diversity of contemporary China. So my argument here today has been that economic security as part of national security requires a focus on development. The GBA, including Hong Kong, sits at the forefront of China's next stages of development as a vibrant and open part of the national economy. Understanding the GBA is not just relevant to this part of southern China, but says something broader about visions of China's development and global interactions. It shows a vision that highlights openness and innovation. In the midst of geopolitical tensions, the prosperity this aims to nurture could be an important underpinning of long-term national security. And if you'll allow me just to conclude with a brief advertisement, I've uploaded a preprint of a book chapter on the GBA. I very much hope that the QR code works. If anyone wants to scan it and read it, you're very welcome to send me any comments afterwards. Thank you very much. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you, Professor Li and Professor Summers, for the inspiring lecture. The professors have kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. May I invite Professor Li and Professor Summers to come to the stage again. If you would like to ask any questions, please raise your hand. For attendees online, you may submit your questions to the Q&A chat room on Zoom.
Thank you, Tim's and Lee's sharing. So I've got one question. You just mentioned about the GBA Outline Development Plan. It is actually initiated in 2019, February. So after 4 to 5 years, from your view, what is the most impressive achievement in terms of economic field and political field? This is the first question. And the second question is, as for the enterprise, if they want to balance between being self-sustainable economy to secure national security versus taking in FDI. That means if they want to collaborate with international companies and take in FDI, how can they balance itself to collaborate with the foreign companies and to protect the national security? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, on the first question, thank you very much. Both are excellent questions. First, in terms of the major progress, I think my own take in this is that, first of all, in terms of infrastructure connection, right, the physical infrastructure, we have made a substantial progress in the last few years, and then in terms of financial market development, right? So we have made major progress, right? We've made arrangement in Stock Connect, Bond Connect, right? The Wealth Management Product Connect, and various other connectivity schemes, which can help to further connect mainland China's financial market with Hong Kong, right? Some of these programs are not just GBA focused, but the GBA will going to be a key part of it. Some of these programs, for example, Wealth Management Product Connect, are more specifically about GBA at this stage, right? So I think in terms of physical infrastructure development, in terms of financial market connectivity, we have already made substantial progress. And also in terms of talent, right? So I think CU Hong Kong as a leading university of GBA, of China, and of Asia is certainly part of this, right? So we have attracted many talent from mainland China and also around the world, right? We've seen several of our students here, right? And hopefully you will find a GBA attractive platform, right, to develop your career. So and also Hong Kong government has made major policy initiatives in terms of further develop Hong Kong as a talent hub, right? Bringing GBA talent to Hong Kong and also create more opportunities for Hong Kong talent to work in GBA. So there are indeed substantial progress, but I think there will be more to come. So regarding the second question in terms of how to balance the participation in the domestic circulation and external circulation, I think for most of the industries, so it's actually, there are not much tensions between these two. For most of the sectors, for example, for let's say daily consumer products, right, for traditional manufactured goods, I think for them, what they need to see is that how to ensure the resilience of the supply chain, right, under times of stress, so that they can serve both export market and domestic market effectively. But for those industries, for example, in relation to the semiconductor industry, right, for those high-tech sectors, which are more sensitive to the geopolitical environment, and then they do have to have a very clear strategy, right, how to balance their overseas development and domestic development. I think here the key is that they need to develop their indigenous innovation capability, right? So only having that, and then you will be in a position to actually choose and strategize, right? Because otherwise, if you are dependent on external supply chain, whatever market you are serving, and then you will be in a relatively vulnerable position. So, and then there's always a compliance issue for you to balance. I think we will need to have, I think some of you may from law school, right? I think our law school graduates will find a lot of opportunities in this dimension, right? How to navigate this increasingly complex global economic governance regime while creating more opportunities for enterprises both in China and multinational companies investing in China to navigate this new compliance environment. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Perhaps I'll focus a little bit on the first question. I think, to be honest, since 2019, we've had a big pause in a lot of things due to the COVID period. And I think one thing that period did highlight was the implications of our separate systems, our immigration controls, our custom controls. We were cut off largely on a day-to-day basis from our hinterland for a long period of time, and that's we're now kind of getting back to normal. But that too was not was perhaps a slightly slower process than it might have been. I mean, you still have to submit your health declaration every time you cross the border and so on. So I think actually that period of COVID highlighted the distinctiveness, the difference, the separateness of the systems in Hong Kong and our hinterland in the mainland. I mean, I agree that the physical connectivity has been enhanced substantially over the years, but I think there's still potential to do more in this area. Just the physical experience of crossing some of the borders between, say, Macau and Zhuhai across land, or Hong Kong and Shenzhen. You go to Luowu, it's very similar to it was many years ago. Right? I think there's a lot of potential there for further enhancing that to further smoothen the flow of people, right, between these different parts of the GBA. So perhaps there's a slightly different side of the coin. It's not to disagree with Professor Li's views, but just to give a different flavor to that experience over the last 3 years since 2019, 4 years.
So thank you to Professor for the kindly sharing. So one quick question. So with a higher degree of the openness of the economy seems to also increase the danger of the national economical security. So what you guys think about how to strike a balance between the openness of the economy as well as the national economical security, especially if taking Hong Kong as an example? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an excellent question. I think this touches the heart of our discussion here. I think there's no easy solution here. So in terms of how to balance securities and when a country is deepening its opening up, right? I think the very idea of dual circulations, the fact that China is making this distinction between international circulation versus domestic circulation while still being committed to gradually deepening its opening up, reflects this kind of balancing, right? So it's not like there should be no mechanisms that separate domestic and international circulation at all, right? So actually we do have mechanisms while trying to enhance this opening up while still maintain this distinction between domestic versus international circulation. So again, let's come back to the role of Hong Kong and the design of these various financial connectivity program as examples. So the difficulty of financial opening up for a developing country is well known in the following sense, that for developing countries that doesn't have a very well-developed financial markets, they are prone to the risks of sudden reversals of capital flow, right? You don't want investors from around the world being optimistic in you and then investing a lot in your country for a while and then suddenly being less optimistic and then withdrawing money away, right? And then this kind of vulnerability to capital flow is a major challenge for developing country. And the traditional response to this is to erect this kind of a firewall or what we call the capital account control mechanisms, right? So yes, a certain type of money, patient capital are welcome, right, to invest in developing country, which use this type of arrangement, while other type of capital flow, for example, more speculative money in the stock market and bond market would face more constraints or not welcome at all. That's the kind of capital account control, right? So China used to have systemic capital account control, but over the past 20 years have been gradually opening up, right? So reduce its capital account control, right? But still, right? In many aspects, China's regulatory regime exercise very close monitoring and supervision over the flow of capital, and you all know this, right? In terms of whether or not you can move money freely between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, right? So there are all sorts of regulatory supervision, right? But the design of financial connectivity program in over the recent few years is actually a closed loop design in the following sense: that let's say for the investors in mainland China who buy stocks and other products in Hong Kong through this connectivity scheme, yes, they can hold these securities, right? But the minute they sell them, actually the funds will bounce back to the domestic accounts, right? So actually, by designing the connectivity scheme in the following way, actually this can mitigate the risks of the sudden capital outflow, right? So and this is just one example of it. And over time, when China is more ready, when China's financial market is more developed, when China is ready for a broader range of capital account opening, and then maybe this design can be altered, right? But at this stage, you see that this is a kind of a balancing arrangement, right? On the one hand, it's about opening up, right? On the other hand, it still creates this kind of design, right? So which create this kind of protection, right? So this kind of a safe buffer, right? In intermediating the domestic circulation and the international circulation, right? So and I think that's my response. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution, right? And this requires talent from different disciplines, right? Law, economics, right? Political science to work together, right? To design mechanisms, policies that can balance these two objectives. Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps I'd just say, I think the assumption that openness is less secure needs to be challenged and thought about critically. And maybe there's a bit of fashion involved here in the way that people are thinking. I think for a long time, perhaps from the 1980s, let's say, to 2015, the dominant thinking in most countries was openness and interconnectivity actually makes you more secure, it makes you more prosperous, right? You benefit from trade and investment flows, you benefit from flows of people, right? Whether it's Chinese students going to study in the US, right? Everybody benefits from this sort of thing. Now, somehow over the last 5 years or so, the dominant mindset has shifted. And now, perhaps because we're aware that interdependence can be weaponized, it can be used, the sort of dominant mindset in many places, right? China, the United States, Europe, has become that openness is risky somehow, and I think we need to rebalance this way of thinking about the relationship between the two somehow. And there are plenty of areas for part of the reason I wanted to focus on development is because it helps us think in the long term, right? If we're going to think about innovation, for example, right, innovation is most effectively done when it's globally networked, when you're linked to the best brains and the best minds in different universities, different companies around the world. Right, and that sort of connection actually helps you become more secure in a genuinely holistic way, right, in the long run. Right? But of course, there may be some short-term risk points or challenges that you need to manage. So getting that balance right is tricky. And I think we're going through a period of change at the moment. And we're going through a period of change that's partly to do with a bigger global power shift that's underway. So in that period I mentioned from, say, 1980 to 2015, right, the US, the West, very much dominant in the global political economy, so ideologically, materially, economically, right, we're now in a different phase, right, where that confidence has diminished somewhat, where it's evident that there are numerous other powers, not just China, but particularly China, who are coming through into real positions of strength within the global political economy. And that creates its own sense of insecurity and uncertainty for people. So you get these vicious cycles, right, if you're not careful, that everybody becomes more and more inclined to be autarkic, you know, drawing in on yourself, right, not drawing on resources from outside. But then you're missing all of the benefits of that openness and connectivity. So certainly some rebalancing. Perhaps the pendulum will swing back. I hope it will over the coming years. At the moment, it's not looking great, right? When you look around the world, it seems this mindset of a more closed mindset is becoming increasingly dominant in many places.
Now, yes,
we have a question. Maybe you want to...
I will read this question. And well, so we have one question from our online audience. The question is, we see quite a bit of efforts focusing on enticing young talents from Hong Kong to GBA. Are you aware of any initiatives to attract more senior executives, Hong Kong or foreign to support the GBA plan? And also, a tax scheme is different from Hong Kong versus mainland, and which is barriers, right? So, what do you think, team?
Yeah, well, I mean, this gets a little bit technical for me when people start talking about tax. But I think that there has been some quite positive work done on the tax arrangements, particularly for people from Hong Kong who want to go and work in the rest of the GBA. Conscious of the different tax rates, right? You can apply for some schemes that allow you not to be penalized for going to work in the rest of the GBA. I think also many of these GBA cities have short-term, quite attractive schemes to attract talent in terms of tax and so on. I think in the long run, perhaps tax is not the only thing that needs to be considered, right? There are other issues, perhaps for international talent, there are issues of, maybe schooling or sort of the international facilities available in cities. Those have been things that Chinese cities have worried about for a long time. But I think many places have made a lot of progress. So it's getting the soft infrastructure right as well as developing, I think what the questioner calls sort of initiatives, right, in place. So it's not just specific initiatives, it's about creating the right environment. You want to add something?
Yeah, I would just add one comment. Well, I think when we talk about talent flow, facilitating talent flow inside the GBA, it's not just about promoting or creating more opportunities for young talent in Hong Kong to work in other cities of GBA. It's also very much about the other way around. So actually, if you look at the demographic structure of Hong Kong versus Shenzhen, actually Shenzhen is in a much better shape in terms of the demographic structure. So Hong Kong actually face an aging society challenges, and Hong Kong needs more young talent. And particularly now, I think we have very clear deficit in terms of the young talent. So we need to attract, we need to nurture more local talent in Hong Kong. We also need to attract more young talent from other cities of GBA, as well as around the world to work in Hong Kong, right? So I think that will be a crucial to the future development and prosperity of Hong Kong as a global city. And we have already seen government in Hong Kong taking initiatives, right, in attracting talent. I think we would be seeing more policies, innovations in this aspect. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee and Professor Summers, for delivering a thought-provoking lecture, as well as sharing your unique insights with us. This concludes today's lecture. Once again, I would like to thank all attendees for joining us, and we wish you a great day ahead.